Link TV, connecting you to the world. Link TV is viewer supported. Watch more at linktv.org.
Link TV presents Mosaic World News from the Middle East. Here are today's top stories.
Anger erupts in Tunisia's disenfranchised Sidi Bouzid. Protesters in Cairo's Tahrir denounce Egypt's ruling junta. And Pakistani demonstrators demand an immediate halt to U.S. drone attacks. Mosaic, world news from the Middle East, begins now.
The city of Sidi Bouzid that sparked the Tunisian revolution witnessed acts of violence after the Independent High Commission for the Elections announced the results of Sunday's Constituent Assembly election. And while the Tunisian army was forced to open fire to disperse protesters, the government imposed a night curfew in Sidi Bouzid. For his part, the leader of the Islamic Ennahda movement, Rashid al-Ghannouchi, called for calm. He said his movement is committed to respect all international treaties.
The Tunisians' hope in electing the first coalition government after the January 14th revolution dwindled after the leader of the Popular Manifesto for Freedom, Justice and Development, al-Hashim al-Hamidi, announced the withdrawal of the 19 seats his party won in the National Constituent Assembly. Al-Hamidi confirmed his party officially withdrew from the political process that invalidated the voices of tens of thousands of Tunisians, especially in Sidi Bouzid, the city that triggered the Tunisian revolution. The city of Sidi Bouzid witnessed a demonstration in which over 1,000 protesters expressed their rage over previous statements made by Ennahda Secretary General Hamadi al-Jubaili. He had previously stated his rejection to forming an alliance with an electoral list headed by a Sidi Bouzid native living abroad. The participants chanted slogans condemning the Ennahda movement and its Secretary General, Hamadi al-Jubaili, including, "Oh, Jubaili, you coward, the people of Sidi Bouzid cannot be insulted," and Ennahda and the Muslim Brotherhood are America's agents. As soon as calm was somewhat restored, violent security disturbances erupted in the city last night due to the Independent High Commission for the Elections announcement that 6 Popular Manifesto for Freedom, Justice and Development electoral lists were annulled. Participants in these disturbances burned the headquarters of the Islamist Ennahda movement in the city. They also set fire to the municipality building and a number of other government institutions. There were also clashes with security and army forces that heavily used tear gas to disperse the protesters. On the other hand, the Islamist Ennahda movement in Tunis accused the counter-revolution forces of being behind the security disturbances in the city. Ennahda considered the events to be disruptions to the democratic path, holding counter-revolutionary forces responsible. The movement expressed trust in the national security forces and army's ability to deal with attempts to disrupt the situation in the country before the election's final results are announced. The head of the Independent High Commission for the Elections, Kamal al-Jandoubi, announced the annulment of 6 Popular Manifesto electoral lists. Al-Jandoubi's announcement was met with a storm of applause during the press conference that was held to announce the results of the elections won by Ennahda.
On to Egypt, where people there have staged a rally in the capital Cairo's landmark Liberation Square against the country's military rulers. The protesters staged the rally following Friday prayers on what's been dubbed as the Friday of Common Demand. They're calling on the military junta to hand over power to a civilian government. They also want the lifting of the country's emergency laws and an end to military trials for civilians. The rally has been organized by 13 political parties and movements. Egypt's military council has come under heavy criticism for failing to quickly transfer power to a civilian authority. The Liberation Square has been the scene of weekly protests against the military council since the toppling of Hosni Mubarak's regime earlier this year. We're going to cross on over and talk to our correspondent Karim Gamaluddin, who is in Tahrir or Liberation Square. Okay, why don't we first start off with the case of Essam Ali Atta, that 24-year-old man who was reportedly tortured and then eventually died while he was in police custody.
Yes, we're actually now in Liberation Square, waiting for the funeral of the victim of the police brutality that died in a public hospital after being sodomized by the by the prison guards in Tura prison. And also to give us a broader picture, I'm being joined now by Reem Dawood. She's an Egyptian activist. Reem, thank you so much for joining us on Press TV.
Thank you.
So what can you tell us about the incidents that happened yesterday night?
Hassan was one of the activists, and he was taken to prison, and actually he was tortured to death to the past 2 days. This was because his mother brought him a mobile chip to be able to talk to his lawyers, because he cannot see anyone, he cannot talk to anyone. And accordingly, when they found it with him, they started torturing him till he died. It's a very well-known way of police brutality that was there before the revolution, and it's still there till now. Currently, he's in the morgue. A lot of protesters are standing there outside waiting for the doctor to come. Of course, the doctor tried to forge one of his papers to say that he died from a natural death, but currently they are protesting to make sure that the paper is going to come out right, and he was tortured, and they will come in a march to here, to the square, and move on after that. And this is not the first guy to die, and not the first activist or man to die this way, and every single man does not have a right to be treated rightly. Even if you're a burglar, even if you're a thief, even if you're a human being that's just protesting, you just shouldn't be treated this way.
Well, a grand tribal gathering, or Jirga, in Islamabad has sought the United Nations intervention to stop U.S. assassination drone strikes in Pakistan's tribal areas. Press TV's Kamran Yusuf reports from Islamabad.
These tribal elders travelled all the way from Pakistan's mountainous borderlands to the capital Islamabad. They joined heads with international human rights campaigners to evolve a strategy against the US assassination drone strikes in the tribal areas. In a day-long tribal jirga, fresh evidence was presented to expose the US claims that assassination drone strikes have only killed pro-Taliban militants. These horrific images speak volumes of heavy loss of life, injury and destruction caused by the CIA's campaign.
The former American ambassador Ann Patterson, she writes back to the State Department saying that the drone attacks are counterproductive. Here you have seen representatives of the tribal areas, you have seen the anger in them. They want revenge. How are they going to seek revenge? By becoming militants or helping militants. So it is counterproductive, you have seen it here. And yet lies and deceit, a web of lies is covering this whole war on terror.
The tribal jirga passed a unanimous resolution calling the country's Chief Justice to initiate an independent investigation into the killings of civilians in US assassination drones.
This Grand Tribal Jirga appeals to the UN Secretary General and UN Special Representative on Extrajudicial Killings to stop US from committing the massacre of tribal people and the violation of Pakistan's sovereignty.
Later, tribesmen joined a massive anti-US protest rally led by cricketer turned politician Imran Khan. They marched towards the parliament and strongly denounced the US for committing what they described the massacre in the tribal areas.
I want to convey a message to the world that these US drone attacks are barbaric. These attacks are only killing civilians. We ask the US to stop this brutality and leave this region.
According to figures compiled by independent organizations, since 2004, over 2,000 people, most of them civilians, have been killed in the US assassination drone attacks.
This is for the first time that victims of US assassination drone attacks and their families have gathered in such big numbers in the Pakistani capital to condemn what they call the CIA's secret war in the tribal areas. Their movement will likely put pressure on the government to implement a parliamentary resolution that calls for an end to the US assassination drone campaign. Kamran Yusuf, Press TV, Islamabad.
In Bahrain, anti-regime protesters have once again taken to the streets across the Persian Gulf island, calling for the downfall of the regime. Well, demonstrators in several cities around the capital, Manama, have come out to call for democracy and freedom. The protests were organized by several opposition groups from across the country. Activists say that several protests have been attacked by Saudi-backed regime forces. Bahrain is in the midst of a revolution that began back in mid-February. Since then, dozens of people have been killed and hundreds more arrested by forces loyal to the ruling al-Khalifa family. Britain founded the regime in 1820 after signing a treaty with the family, giving it the title Rulers of Bahrain.
In Yemen, hundreds of thousands of people gathered in al-Sitin Square in the capital Sana'a and 17 other cities on what they called the Friday of Victory comes only from God. They are demanding the downfall and prosecution of the Yemeni president's regime, while the supporters of President Saleh gathered in al-Sabin Square on their own Friday, which they called the Friday of Prince Sultan bin Abdulaziz. On the other hand, opposition sources said Gulf Cooperation Council Secretary General Abdulatif al-Zayani and the UN Special Envoy to Yemen, Jamal bin Omar, are arriving in Sana'a today to look into the implementation of the Gulf Initiative.
Victory comes only from God. This is another Friday for Yemen's revolutionaries who are constantly escalating their mobilization with the goal of peacefully toppling President Saleh's regime. Hundreds of thousands gathered in Al-Sitin Square in the capital Sana'a and other cities, tirelessly repeating the same slogans. In southern Sana'a, Saleh's supporters gathered as usual in Al-Sabin Square on their Friday, which they called the Friday of Prince Sultan. They performed prayers for those absent and renewed their commitment to what they call constitutional legitimacy. The two gatherings, one for Saleh's supporters and the other for those revolting against him, coincided with reports of the arrival of the GCC and UN envoys to discuss the Gulf Initiative. This initiative is rejected by the youth of the revolution because they believe it grants Saleh immunity from legal prosecution and does not meet their demands for freedom and dignity. As for the opposition joint meeting parties, it harshly criticized the ruling party's willingness to implement the initiative, describing it as complicated and unacceptable. It also completely rejects any amendments to the initiative, not even one letter. The ruling Congress Party is calling for early presidential elections and the formation of a national unity government, which will take the oath in front of Saleh, not his deputy, a proposal rejected by the opposition. Friday after Friday, the youth of the revolution long for the day on which their revolution will move forward. Their revolution has been and remains peaceful despite the bloodshed in their squares. They say it is the toll of their freedom and the price of building their new Yemen.
The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights said 30 people were killed across various parts of the country. The Syrian opposition named today's protest the No-Fly Zone Friday, demanding additional international pressure on the regime in Damascus. Protests broke out in the provinces of Homs, Daraa, Deir ez-Zor, Idlib, Hama, and Aleppo, as well as in Al-Qamishli, Amuda, and Damascus. Activists said the Syrian army and security forces stormed areas in the countryside of Damascus in pursuit of activists and to prevent the protests.
Demonstrations following Friday prayers were staged across various Syrian regions. Security forces fired live ammunition to disperse the protesters, especially in the areas of Homs and Hama, which have become confrontation hubs against Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's regime, as confirmed by rights groups and activists. For several weeks, the two provinces have been witnessing military operations by the Syrian army. As is the case on each Friday, Syrian opponents called for protests on Facebook under the slogan No-Fly Zone Friday, shame and disgrace on those shelling our children from helicopters.
The no-fly zone alone is not enough. They must send foreign observers and media outlets to show what's happening on the ground. They must take all necessary measures to prevent this regime from continuing to kill the people. 26 and not 15 martyrs fell today.
The French news agency quoted the Syrian coordination committees, saying Syrian army and security forces stormed this morning the areas of East Ghouta, Hufar Butna, Suqba, Hamuriya, and Jisrin in the countryside of Damascus in pursuit of wanted activists and to prevent protests in the province. Homs, Hama, Banyas, Deir ez-Zor, Daraa, Aleppo, Damascus, Al-Kamishli, Amuda, and Idlib also witnessed peaceful protests demanding the downfall of the regime, as confirmed by rights groups. In Al-Rastan, which witnessed a massive security operation a few weeks ago, protesters staged rallies demanding the downfall of the regime. Many areas also witnessed nighttime protests calling for the departure of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's regime. Today's protests were held under the slogan of No-Fly Zone Friday, seen as the opposition's message to the international community to mount additional pressure on Damascus.
We will continue to stage street protests, strikes and civil disobedience. We will try to invent new methods of struggle, but we will not resort to military confrontation. So we urge the international community to intervene and mount pressure on the regime, economically and politically. They need to threaten the regime with violence if it doesn't stop the killing of civilians.
The French envoy to the UN Security Council announced on Thursday that the Council's members will meet to discuss the possibility of drafting a resolution against Syria. This comes following the failed efforts at the UN caused by China and Russia's vetoes. The Chinese envoy to the Middle East, who visited Syria, said his country calls for implementing reform through dialogue and other peaceful methods. The Chinese envoy also called for respecting the people's will and the legitimate demands. He said all forms of violence must be halted to prevent bloodshed. 7 months have passed since the uprising erupted in Syria. More than 3,000 civilians have been killed, and the regime is still insisting that it is fighting armed terrorist groups to justify its incursions into cities to quell the protests. With the growing defections among the Syrian army and the eruption of armed clashes, the situation has become very dangerous, prompting those concerned for Syrian unity to warn against sparking a sectarian civil war in the country. Hayan Yaqub, BBC.
Dozens of Iraqi citizens held a rally today in Tahrir Square in central Baghdad to express support for government measures that include arrest campaigns targeting Saddam's Baath officials.
Like every Friday, protesters converged on Baghdad's Tahrir Square to express their opinions regarding the unfolding developments in the country. Today, the protesters expressed support for the government's measures, which include issuing legal orders and arresting leaders of the deposed Saddam's Baath party. The square witnessed a protest today in solidarity with this campaign.
We demand the High Judiciary Council, the Prime Minister and the Iraqi Parliament Speaker to execute the arrest warrants against members of the deposed tyrant and infidel Baath Party, which has harassed and repressed us for 35 years through the mass graves, Halabja and the 1991 uprising.
The demonstrators called for the immediate arrest of all terrorists who seek to disturb the peace and security of the Iraqi people. They also raised slogans demanding the punishment of anyone supporting Saddam's Baath party, as cited by Article 7 of the Iraqi Constitution, which bans any entity from participating or promoting Baathist ideals and symbols, regardless of the name that it adopts.
We plead to His Excellency the Prime Minister to order the arrest of anyone seeking to derail the political process. The derailment of the political process means the derailment of the Iraqi people, because we are the ones who voted this government in office.
The protesters also called on Iraqi security forces to crush the Saddam Baathist conspiracy and arrest anyone plotting against the political process, which was built by the Iraqi people. The protesters also praised the democratic process in the new Iraq, as stipulated in Article 3, Paragraph 38 of the Iraqi Constitution, which guarantees freedom of expression and peaceful protests.
من ساحة التحرير جاءت هذه المرة.
From the Tahrir Square, the protesters expressed support for the Iraqi government's measures aimed at arresting the leaders of the deposed Baath party who are desperately trying to reverse the political process. However, the Iraqi people and the concerned citizens of Iraq have stopped them. From Tahrir Square in central Baghdad, Zayed Al-Ta'i, Iraqiya.
Now in the studio to shed some light on the news of the day is Kalev Ben David, senior Israel correspondent for Bloomberg News. Good evening, Kalev.
Pleasure to be here.
Thanks for being here. It's going to be kind of a smorgasbord tonight. We have a lot to cover, but let's start with Egyptian-Israeli relations. After the Ilan Grapple and Gilad Shalit deals, is Egypt trying to repair its relationship with Israel, perhaps in an attempt to be a serious broker in the Middle East?
Well, I'm not sure I'd go that far. I mean, there are some encouraging signs. We also saw last week the renewal of flow of natural gas into Israel from Egypt, from this pipeline that has been attacked. But I think here it's a case, we have elections coming up in Egypt. Nobody knows what that new government is going to look like. And I think this present government, really run by the military, wanted to basically get old business off the table before that new government came in. They were under a lot of pressure from the U.S. So I'm not sure this is a turning point.
Many find this grapple deal a bit strange, and they're wondering, is there maybe more to this story? I mean, Israel has claimed many times now that Ilan Grapple was not a spy. So the question still remains, why would Israel exchange prisoners in return for Ilan Grapple?
Right. Well, first of all, the prisoners released, these were basically sort of for criminal offenses. They were minor. Probably Israel maybe is happy to put them in Egyptian hands. Grapple seized. It looks like confusion in the Egyptian government. The political situation there is very uncertain. If there may be more, there is talk. Of course, there's an Israeli Bedouin who's still being held on charges of spying in an Egyptian jail, and there are talks that this may be part of some deal to free him in the works. But I wouldn't read too much into it. Looks like it was basically a sort of error on the part of the Egyptian government, and this was a way to clean it up.
Let's move on now to the quartet. As we know, there's been no progress to bring the Israelis and the Palestinians back to the negotiating table. Israel has said that it is willing to come back to the table in accordance with the quartet demands, but the Palestinians have so far refused. Why is it, in your opinion, that we're not seeing more pressure from the Middle East quartet on the Palestinians to return to negotiations?
Well, I mean, I think there is some pressure, but some of the members, and maybe from the U.S. side, but there are some members within the quartet, particularly Russia, that has been more sympathetic to the Palestinian position, and that what you see from the quartet is not what you're going to see from the U.S., for example. I mean, there is, of course, this issue of settlements. There's talk, reports of trying to get some kind of quiet settlement freeze from the Prime Minister. I think that's unlikely. The Palestinians anyway say they'll reject it. So really, not much cause for optimism at this stage.
Khartoum has started implementing economic austerity measures that will last 3 years under the framework of the tripartite program to rehabilitate the Sudanese economy in the post-secession period. The austerity program is being attributed to several factors, most notably the loss of southern oil revenues, which coincides with the fallout of the global economic crisis, in addition to the siege imposed on Sudan.
There
have been major ramifications on the Sudanese economy over the past 2 years due to unilateral peace-related spending, as the situation continues to deteriorate with the loss of southern oil revenues. This has placed additional pressure on the central bank to meet the cost of imports of goods and food products in light of the steady rise of foreign currencies against the Sudanese pound.
In my opinion, this has affected all foreign oil reserves held by the government. The problem started in 2009 with regards to peace-related spending, and it ended in a crisis after the loss of revenues, since they are now being shared by 2 states, with one in the south. Oil proceeds are no longer included in the budget.
The secession of the South has forced both countries to face economic challenges. The South, despite its control of oil proceeds, suffers from slow trade activity with North Sudan, which prompted Southern Sudan's Salva Kiir to visit Khartoum. However, the Sudanese government is betting on its steadfastness and ability to overcome its internal problems, as well as take part in dealing with the global economic crisis.
Our recommendations are not for lifting the Sudanese economy from the immediate crisis, but to research and find solutions for the suffering of the world after the failure of the capitalist system. We need to find an exit by returning to God, who will lead us out of this severe economic crisis. And we need to avoid charging interest because it is like fighting against God.
Launching agricultural investment projects, reducing government spending, and attracting foreign capital, especially from friendly countries, are new approaches proposed by the Sudanese government in a bid to close its budget gaps due to the loss of southern oil revenues. Sudan announced a new economic plan to combat the global economic crisis and the fallout from the secession of the South. The objective is to help create economic stability under the reign of the Second Republic of Sudan. Mohamed Al-Hussein, Al-Alam, Khartoum.
The Sudanese government unveiled that the country's average crude oil production has reached 11,800 barrels per day since the separation with the South in July. The government said it will expand oil drilling next year. The secession led the southern state to take over most of the oil reserves in the country. Khartoum has lost most of its oil proceeds, which are its main source of revenue, leading to a negative impact on the overall national economy.
The views expressed on Mosaic are from contributing broadcasters, not Link TV or its sponsors. The production of Mosaic is made possible by grants from the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, the Wincoat Foundation, the Firedoll Foundation, and by support of viewers like you. Thank you. Watch Mosaic World News online. Stay up to date with breaking news, read our blog, get transcripts of past shows, and more at linktv.org/mosaic.
This program is brought to you by Link TV for educational and non-commercial use only. Link TV is the only U.S. network dedicated to global and national news, uncompromising documentaries, and diverse cultural programs which connect you to the world.